Okay, fantastic. Well, welcome everyone to the North Central Region Aging Network webinar for December 4th, 2020. My name is Dr. Jim Bates, and it's a pleasure to be with you. I'm a field specialist of family wellness with Ohio State University Extension. And today the title of my presentation is Grandparents Helping Grandparents Navigate the Coronavirus Pandemic.
Jim, can you make sure to press record on your end, or did you already?
I did.
Okay, perfect. Thank you.
What's the best advice you've ever received, and who gave it to you? Did you ask for it, or was it unsolicited? This presentation details advice generously shared by grandparents to other grandparents and their families about how to thrive through the coronavirus pandemic. There are an estimated 64 million grandparents living in the United States, and those who have strong ties to their children and grandchildren really enjoy a place of esteem and respect. So much so that many grandparents are involved in the day-to-day care of grandchildren and support the needs of their families in normal times. The specific support provided by grandparents is based on the needs of families and the abilities of grandparents to provide it, but typically includes emotional, financial, caregiving, and instrumental support. During this time of global concern over the coronavirus pandemic and the accompanying state, county, and nationally imposed restrictions such as stay-at-home orders, self-isolation mandates, physical and social distancing, etc., families are having to adjust the type and frequency of contact they have with each other. And the adaptations families are making to stay in contact, coupled with the general concern over the health and wellness of loved ones, has implications for the relational, physical, emotional, and economic well-being of the generations. These past 9 months have been a unique opportunity for me as a grandparent researcher and as an extension specialist to explore the experiences of families during an event that has affected practically all Americans. And this presentation details my recent empirical study to learn about the experiences of grandparents during the coronavirus pandemic. The study results provide extension professionals an opportunity to share these recent experiences and these recent relevant scientific findings about the coronavirus pandemic with the grandparents that they work with and those grandparents' family members. A qualitative research study was initiated in May 2020 and lasted, so this was about 2 months after the first stay-at-home orders came into effect in the state of Ohio. Data collection ended in June of 2020, so there was about 5 or 6 weeks of data collection. Recruitment occurred through word of mouth and with the assistance of Ohio State University Extension professionals who shared the recruitment letter and consent form with their local constituents. And during that recruitment period, a total of 21 grandparents ranging in age from 58 to 77 years old, including 3 grandfathers, participated in the study. Most of the grandparents were or had been involved in some kind of kinship care. And caregiving status, however, was not a requirement for inclusion in the study. And so there wasn't a formal question asking if participants were currently kinship caregivers. All the grandparents had a close relationship with at least one of their grandchildren. Interviews conducted occurred via Zoom, and that occurred either with phone or video enabled, and sometimes both. And there was one interview that occurred via email over concerns about privacy. The interviews lasted between 35 and 98 minutes, and they were recorded, both audio and video, when the video was included. And Zoom has a function where it automatically transcribes the audio. But I had to go back through and clean the audio manually. Responses to only one interview question are reported here in this presentation. I had about 500 pages, single-spaced pages of material. And during this time, I've focused my attention on just one of those interview questions. And that question was, do you have any advice for other grandparents who are currently dealing with the coronavirus pandemic? Some of the grandparents gave very extensive and detailed advice, and others did not. A modified grounded theory analysis was conducted, modified in that I am not seeking to develop hypothesized causal associations. And to analyze the interview narrative, I explored the content in which the advice was given, the context in which the advice was given, and the purpose behind the advice. So in the first reading of the narratives, I noted the number of different or unrelated pieces or categories of advice. After reading through several interviews, it became apparent that there were some commonalities, and there were also different purposes to the advice that was given. Some advice was directed at helping grandchildren specifically. Some advice was directed at helping grandparents specifically. And some advice was directed at helping the family or society in general. So next, I identified common purposes of the advice and classified those as themes. There were 4 themes that emerged after the initial reading. And in subsequent readings, I created a subcategory list for the advice and then listed individual pieces of advice, some of which were duplicates. And so then after that, the findings are trustworthy based on my training in and work on previous empirical qualitative research studies, experience conducting interviews, and expertise in the area of grandparent studies. The interview questions were also shared with a colleague who has similar methodological and content training. So the advice that I want to share over the next several slides centered on the motivation by the grandparents were motivated by a desire to help other grandparents. I mean, that's the purpose of advice, right? It's to help people through a challenging experience. The advice was categorized into 4 main purposes or themes. 1, to help grandparents relate to and connect with their grandchildren. 2, to help grandparents get through the stresses of the pandemic. 3, to help grandchildren be successful during the pandemic. And 4, to help grandchildren and grandparents be prepared for the future. I just want to also mention at this time that I had last month, I had an opportunity to reconnect with a large sample of these grandparents. there were grandparents who were recruited through a senior center in the Cleveland area. And the grandparents who attend this senior center, they have every week a conference call. And I was invited by the senior center leader to participate in this conference call and to share back with a pretty good handful of these grandparents who participated in the study the findings of this advice that had been given. And it was just fascinating to talk with them again and to be reconnected with them over the phone. Even though I couldn't see their faces, I could recognize their voices and recognize the names that they were calling each other in terms of their personal names. So it was a fun experience for me to go back to a good portion of the sample and share back with them in person the things that they shared with me. And now that I was able to analyze the data, to share with them those themes. So theme number one, help grandparents relate to and connect with their grandchildren. I decided, because a lot of these pieces of advice were short phrases, to create these little word clouds. And I'll read through the more detailed version of the advice as we go through each of these themes. But the advice centering on this theme to help grandparents relate to and connect with their grandchildren, usually what we've been experiencing is that we've been living this intergenerational relationship from a distance. And how do we connect with our grandchildren from a distance, now that we can't see them or touch them or hug them or kiss them? So one subcategory was to keep in touch through letters, through cards, through calls, visits through the window or at a distance, if possible, across the street, to have a conversation from the sidewalk or across the street, rather than having a conversation in the living room. Some suggested using low-tech stuff like cards and letters, and others suggested, well, learn how to use tech so that you can be open to connecting with them through the tech, through the means that they're comfortable with as well. Gifts. Provide gifts or little remembrances to help the grandchildren, have at the top of mind their grandparent. Show affection, in as much as you can in a letter or in a card, with hugs, or and some people said, don't be upset that you can't hug. Don't be upset that you can't touch your grandchildren or give them kisses, but tell them that you love them and take care of your family, and to focus on taking care of your family. And finally, one grandparent said, it's really the little things that matter. Maybe it's those little remembrances or those little gifts to help them remember their grandparents. And then finally, to be supportive of their grandchildren. Now, some of the grandparents were kinship caregiving, or were in a kinship caregiving situation. So they had custody of their grandchildren. And in those situations, grandparents were the parent and were the teacher, now that a lot of those kids were at home doing schoolwork at home. So there was a focus on being supportive, being positive, and helping their children and grandchildren make positive choices. Help them when they need counsel and advice and encouragement. Be there for them. Teach them the right things. And there was an interesting note here, but don't spoil them. So as we think about, grandparents' advice to other grandparents of how to relate to and connect with their grandchildren, honestly, there isn't a whole lot of difference between pre-pandemic or non-pandemic advice in this matter versus pandemic advice. The advice is pretty much the same: to keep in touch, to show love, to take care of your family. Those seem to be the main highlights of how to relate to and connect with the grandchildren. I'll also mention here that to talk and to listen, those were also things that came up as pieces of advice. To allow the grandchildren to talk and for grandparents to listen, to really listen is the phrase that grandparents used. The next theme is to help grandparents get through the stresses of the pandemic. Realize things will get better and that this will end was one of the most common pieces of advice. The other most common piece was to take care of yourself with protective gear so that you'll be around longer, was the phrase that was used. Take care of yourself first so that you can care for your grandchildren. Take care of yourself through social and physical distancing, and to take care of yourself through washing your hands, wearing your mask, and being smart about who you're around and being cautious. Some grandparents also suggested to grandparents who are involved in that day-to-day care and also that schooling aspect of care is to reach out to other grandparents to help those grandparents with resources and information related to grandchildren who may have special needs. The schools were in contact with a lot of these grandparents, and grandparents did suggest to stay in touch with the teachers at school, to reach out to them and to focus on that educational part of the grandchildren's life. They also reminded grandparents to be strong, stay strong, be grateful for your family, be prayerful, continue, keep your faith, maintain your faith, take it day by day, think positive, don't worry or think negative. They said, don't complain, don't be afraid, think positive, be brave, keep yourself active so that you can be healthy and involved, so that you're not stressed out with all of the changes in routine and all of the crazy things that are going on. Listen to your civic leaders was another response by grandparents. And be grateful that you're still here and that you're healthy, and to not take things for granted. So a lot of this advice, again, was focused on almost like a cheerleader. You'll get through this. This is a tough time. This is a stressful time, but keep the faith, focus on your family, and things will get better. The third theme of advice was to help grandchildren be successful during the pandemic. So we see grandparents talking about this idea of a model or an example. So it was very apparent that grandparents were talking to each other about, your grandkids are watching what you're doing. So you need to be an example of taking care of yourself so that the grandchildren will want to take care of themselves as well, so that they'll know how to take care of themselves. Be an example of being strong in front of the grandchildren. Being an example of being positive and not complaining, so the grandchildren will come out enjoying life. So this idea of being an example, these grandparents instinctively knew that grandchildren were watching them, and that a lot of their power came from being an example and being a model of how to get through this pandemic. Another part of this advice was to try to see things through the grandchild's perspective or through the grandchild's eyes when they're having a hard time during the lockdowns. And I thought this was really interesting. One grandmother was very circumspect and thoughtful. She said, you know, I have to step back when my teen and tween age grandchildren are just fed up with life. This one grandmother said, you know, they hear all the fussing and the crying of the younger grandchildren, and they're around these old people all the time, is what she said. But these kind of preteen age grandchildren, they're used to being with their friends, and they can't be around their friends. They're used to being at school. They're used to having a different kind of lifestyle. So this grandmother advised other grandparents to just kind of step back and try to see it through the grandchild's perspective. And maybe that would provide some compassion or some additional perspective for the grandparents. Another grandparents also said, don't lose your cool when you get frustrated. Be patient. Help them to practice the social distancing, the physical distancing, and the safety guidelines by reminding them and helping to protect them with masks or with washing their hands and being safe around other people. They also said to talk to the grandchildren, kind of teach them what's going on and talk to them, allow the grandchildren to open up. Another grandmother said to keep them fed. She noticed that the routines that they normally had flew out the window. These grandchildren were done with, were trying to figure out a new routine, but they couldn't essentially figure that out. So with grandmother, after a few weeks, she realized, you know what, we need to have a routine. And she noticed that her grandchildren were always eating, always snacking. So they'd come into the kitchen, they were bored. So they'd open up the fridge, you know, what can I eat? You know, so her advice was to keep them fed, but keep them on a schedule as well, and feed them healthy foods. Help them with their schoolwork. Help them make sure that their schoolwork is getting done. Stay in touch with their teachers. Help them to think positive about the situation and their new routines. Help the grandchildren be active and busy, but don't let them sit in front of video games, was the advice that they had. So, you know, so this is advice to help grandchildren be successful during the pandemic. And these are ways to help these grandchildren through the ups and downs. And I think that this is a key part to helping these grandchildren learn to be resilient. That grandparents are really setting an example of how to be resilient, how to get through a really tough situation. Finally, theme number 4 is the purpose of this advice was to help grandchildren and grandparents be prepared for the future. And this was the smallest of the themes. But there was a definite focus here on teaching grandchildren life skills so that they can be prepared for life's challenges. Try to teach them, and when they get frustrated, to just listen to them, to maybe not give them that advice, but to help them be prepared for those life challenges. And so the key skill here was to encourage them to talk out and talk through their challenges, and so that they learn that coping skill rather than expressing their frustration through becoming physically angry or through a violent means or through getting in trouble with the law. But the skill here was to allow them to talk, and the grandparents can be that sounding board for their grandchildren. Grandparents, one grandmother said, there will be another one. There will be another pandemic, and to get ready for it. And finally, this idea that life has drama, life has tragedy, and there will be accidents that happen, and that this is an opportunity to learn how to get through something really tough, and to get through something that's just really random and really weird and really unusual. One thing to note about a handful of these grandparents was that they had also lost children and grandchildren to death through a variety of different means, different ways. And these grandparents had experienced tragedy in their lives, and that they were trying to be resilient and to try to prepare their grandchildren for life's challenges. So the implications for extension professionals, and really this is a culmination of and a conclusion to the presentation. Grandparents are resilient to the crucibles of life, and they model for their grandchildren and their children how to adapt to very difficult situations. So modeling resiliency is likely the most stabilizing influence a grandparent can demonstrate for their family. And it communicates confidence, self-determination, fortitude, and hope. And so these lessons are key to helping others navigate life's challenges. And, like I've been talking about, this modeling of resiliency and being an example of being resilient. Extension professionals who work with adults of this life stage, they can encourage them to be actively engaged in their grandchildren's lives. We do a lot of formal and informal education with all sorts of different people. And many of the people we work with are grandparents. And so this is an opportunity to encourage them to be actively involved and actively engaged in their grandchildren's lives for the sole purpose of modeling resiliency, if nothing else. Extension professionals working with parents can encourage them to accept the help offered by grandparents. Grandparents may be able to assist with the grandchildren's extracurricular activities if those haven't been restricted by the county or by the state. Grandparents can also assist with online school activities and homework and other commitments while parents are working from home or fulfilling other employment obligations. Grandparents do not need to be physically present to carry out this assistance with some of those activities. A lot of that can be done virtually over tech. Some can't, but some can. Finally, grandparents who have adopted new technologies to communicate with their family members during the pandemic restrictions may be more confident and capable of using those same technologies to engage with extension professionals in our outreach. And I think if we have swung in any direction in extension, is that we have swung toward using technology to connect with people. And if our grandparents that we work with have swung in any direction, it's that they have swung toward using technology, becoming comfortable with technology, and using that technology to connect with their family, with their friends, and hopefully with us as extension professionals. So I want to thank you for participating in today's webinar. This will be offered and be posted online and archived there. Feel free to reach out to me. We do have an NCRAN survey that you're welcome to take, and you're also welcome to reach out to me and email me with any questions or comments. So this time I'll also stop the share, and we'll open this chat if anybody has any comments or questions about the study that they'd like to offer. Okay, awesome. Well, it was a pleasure to be here with you today. There's a lot of names on this webinar I don't recognize. Um, and yes, okay. So we have a little message here. Pat, let's see. Let's we get that link in the chat box. Yes, give me just a second. Oops. Okay, here's the link to the evaluation. Okay, so any information on how grandparents would want to learn about new technology or the best way to reach them. I was recently, boy, I can't remember where I saw this, but there is an effort to connect teens with grandparents or seniors. And the sole purpose of this gathering, if you will, is to teach them how to use tech. Now, of course, you know, in most situations, we can't necessarily sit down with those seniors to you know, teach them how to use the tech. So family members are usually the next best option. So if there's nothing going on between the schools or in the community and a senior center or something like that, where non-family members are gathering to learn about how to use tech, what I found is most of these, in fact, a few of the grandparents in the study had their children or grandchildren set up the tech for the interview. And to teach them how to use the Zoom or and the video functions as well. So those are just some different ideas. You know, if we have access to extension audiences who are professionals, as professionals to parents, excuse me, we can encourage those parents to connect with their grandparents and teach them how to use tech. And that's like an indirect way of getting to those grandparents. Okay, any other questions? Okay, thanks everybody. Take care and have a great Friday. Have a great weekend.